Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is Yemen. How did we get into this mess called Yemen? How did the U.S. not see what was happening in Yemen? Why did the U.S. not prevent Yemen from falling to the Houthi? This was a huge regional blunder. The answer is that the U.S. made elementary mistakes. The United States had all the intelligence, all the info. They just did not perceive the Houthi as a power that could and would take over, not just Sana'a, the capital, but the entire country, or at least most of the country. The U.S. thought the Houthi were weak and disorganized. They saw them just like they saw ISIS. The attention of the United States was focused on confronting al-Qaeda of Yemen. The Houthi were, quite literally, left alone. Another reason the U.S. left the Houthi alone is because the Houthi are sponsored and supported by Iran. The United States did not want to disturb or irritate Iran and jeopardize their very sensitive nuclear talks. Now, Saudi Arabia has begun the task of confronting the Houthi. The Saudis cannot have an extremist group, an Islamic extremist group, spilling over across their border. The United States has dozens of drones flying and relaying Houthi movements to the Saudi Air Force. Also joining Saudi Arabia in the air and the air strikes are the Jordanian Air Force and the Egyptian Air Force. The United States did nothing as Yemen fell. Now they're providing only intelligence. This is a colossal failure on the part of the United States, even bigger than Libya. Now, make no mistakes, this is a huge conflict, but it's a conflict between the Sunnis and the Shiites, the Saudis and Iran. So when the Saudis began airstrikes against the Houthi Shiites, who have taken over most of Yemen, the Saudis vowed that the Sunni kingdom will do, quote, anything necessary, unquote, to protect their neighbor from the Iranian-backed Shiite rebels. The air campaign was announced at the Saudi embassy in Washington, D.C. by the ambassador Abdel al-Jubeir. Now, the Saudis in D.C. almost never have a press conference. They prefer back channels for almost everything. And add to that they were announcing an offensive military action by Saudi Arabia. That was just out of the ordinary. Putting that into the perspective that Saudi Arabia is also a partner in the U.S.-led coalition against ISIS and al-Qaeda, and you have some perspective. Saudi Arabia quickly cobbled together 10 Middle East countries to join their coalition against the Houthi Shiites and the takeover of Yemen. Let me just show you a good, simple map. Maps help us see and understand better. In a statement published by the Saudi press agency, the Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain all said that they would answer a request from the Yemeni president, Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi, and pledged their support. This is the exact statement, quote, to protect Yemen and his dear people from the aggression of the Houthi militias, which were and are still a tool in the hands of foreign powers that don't stop meddling with the security and stability of brotherly Yemen, unquote. Interestingly, Oman, the sixth member of the Gulf Cooperation Council, did not sign on to that statement. The conflict has been going on for months in Yemen, and weeks ago the capital of Sana'a fell, and Yemen's president was chased from the capital by the Houthi and eventually exiled the country. Hadi, the president of Yemen, abandoned the country, leaving on a boat from the southern port of Aden. Yemeni security officials actually reported that. His departure came after the Iranian-backed Houthi airstrikes attacked his troops and rained down a barrage of armaments. If it was not clear yet, It is now. The Iranian-backed Houthi held air superiority, and the world remained silent. Any attempt to keep Hadi in power was totally useless. Hadi, the president of Yemen, calls for an international no-fly zone, been totally disregarded. On the ground, the Houthi were advancing towards his position. When the Saudi ambassador to the United States, Al-Jubair, made the announcement that Saudi Arabia and other Arab nations were going to use their air forces to stop the Shiite Houthi, the ambassador Jubair said, quote, he had never seen militias with air power, unquote. That was a reference to Iranian support and their massive deliveries of weaponry to the Houthi. Al-Jubair said the Houthi have, quote, always chosen the path of violence, unquote. He declined to say whether the Saudi campaign involved U.S. intelligence assistance, but we know that the U.S. has several dozen drones flying at any given moment above Yemen, and that they are transferring the movements of the Houthi to the Saudis. The ambassador said the Saudis will, quote, do anything necessary to protect the people of Yemen and, quote, the legitimate government of Yemen, unquote. President Hadi of Yemen's departure illustrates how one of the most important American counterterrorism efforts has totally disintegrated, leaving the country wide open for what could be a deeply destabilizing proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The Saudi announcement only reinforced that notion. Just a bit more of background. 3 years ago, American officials were celebrating Hadi's rise to power in the U.S. It was a brokered deal that ended the long-time rule of Ali Abdullah Saleh during the political upheaval of what we call now the Arab Spring. President Obama mentioned this whole thing and Yemen as an example in his January 2015 State of the Union address, just a few months ago, as an example of a successful Middle East policy. President Obama was still calling Yemen a counterterrorism success story, even as the CIA warned that Iranian-backed Houthi rebels were growing restive in the north of the country. What is going on? Here is what happened. Over the past few years, the U.S. has spent oodles of time focusing on al-Qaeda of Yemen as a threat and never even assessed the danger of the Houthi. We constantly heard about al-Qaeda of Yemen, also known as al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula. How crazy is that? But the Houthi were growing in power and training. Also, the Houthi and al-Qaeda were sworn enemies. So the hope was maybe that they would self-destruct, killing one another. No, al-Qaeda found a serious stronghold, and the Houthi became the powerhouse as it was funded and sponsored by Iran. Several days before the massive Houthi push, the American embassy closed, and the last U.S. troops evacuated the country just days before the takeover. The Houthi have seized control over much of the country, certainly the major cities, and are avowed enemies of al-Qaeda in the West. Deeply anti-American, the Houthi have rejected U.S. overtures. They despise all forms of culture and religion other than their own. The U.S. focused on al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, also known as AQAP. It was considered the most dangerous terror group to the U.S. in the world. It successfully placed 3 bombs on U.S.-bound airlines, although none of them exploded. The chaos in Yemen is giving al-Qaeda breathing space. Beyond terrorism, the latest developments in Yemen have worrisome implications for the entire Middle East, already racked by Sunni-Shia conflicts. Before the airstrikes began, Saudi Arabia bolstered its troop presence along its border with Yemen. One must understand that this is once again all about Sunni versus Shiites. It's about Saudi versus Iran. It's a serious conflict. The U.S. is clueless. In an answer to how they plan to respond to the situation in Yemen, listen to the U.S. response. A senior American official who declined to be quoted by name said, quote, the tinderbox in Yemen is most complicated because of the geopolitics at stake. The U.S. Saudis, Iranian, Houthis, Yemenis, the Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula, ISIL, and Al-Qaeda have equities in the situation and factor into any decision the U.S. makes or doesn't make. That's just a load of it. The president and the foreign minister have run into exile. The parliament is dissolved. Coming up next, points of view. Here's what some important voices have been talking about. First up is a column by Jonah Goldberg, a syndicated columnist. The piece originally appeared on March 28, 2015. Goldberg is born in 1969. He is the editor-at-large of the National Review Online. He's a protege of Ben Wattenberg, one of the early and important conservative thinkers in D.C. And actually, Goldberg created a think tank around Ben Wattenberg called Think Tank of Ben Wattenberg, after they both left the American Enterprise Institute. Jonah Goldberg is an entertaining and engaging thinker. He loves to push the envelope, not to be confused with the leftist counterpart, whose last name is also Goldberg, Jeffrey Goldberg, who was also extremely entertaining and extremely engaging. Jonah Goldberg grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. He graduated actually from Goucher College in Baltimore and was in the second graduating class of men. He is constantly making references to Star Trek in his columns, so the Trekkies out there can connect and relate. Beam me up, Scotty, so to speak. He writes twice a week for the National Review Online. This piece originally aired there, it appeared there, and then was syndicated and published in papers across the country. The column is entitled, Does Jew Equal Democrat? The pointed question is dicey and probably a bit poisonous, if not very touchy, to ask in certain circles. But he asks it. After all, in the U.S., Jews have constantly and traditionally, and will most probably in the near future, continue to vote Democrat. So Goldberg asks why, but he uses a comment from a Republican congressman from Iowa, Stephen King, to make his point. He begins, I don't understand, this is a quote from King, I don't understand how Jews in America can be Democrats first and Jewish second, and support Israel along the line of following their president. Vented Stephen King, Republican of Iowa, on Boston Herald Radio last week. Goldberg continues, it was a small controversy in the grand scheme of things, unquote. Now Goldberg then shows how the comment upset people. He gives explanations as to why Jews have historically voted left from FDR to the sitting president, the fact that Democrats were seen as liberal and open to Jews, and that traditionally the Republicans were not open at all to Jews. Goldberg ends, though, saying this, quote, Jews are still liberal because ideological and partisan affiliations die hard. They tend to be passed like religion itself, from parent to child, generation to generation. But such loyalties aren't static either. And while Steve King could have phrased it better, he was absolutely right at some point. Now, or in the future, support for the left and support for Israel must conflict. And King is right to lament it when Jews choose the former over the latter, unquote. Goldberg is saying that the Democrats have sold Israel down the river and that the Republicans are the defenders of Israel. I think that he is exaggerating. There are still plenty of Democrats who are hardcore supporters of Israel, and we have to remember that. We are nowhere close to where Stephen King and Jonah Goldberg are in terms of the Democratic-Republican split on Israel. The next piece is from the New York Times. People ask me, why do I constantly select pieces from the New York Times? The question requires a serious answer, especially because some of you don't even read the New York Times, and others think I should draw from other sources. Regardless of your point of view about the Times, it is still the most influential paper in the English-speaking world, and we, you and I, need to discuss the opinions there, especially about Israel and the Middle East. We need to call them to task, and we need to be part of the discussion. Those who boycott the New York Times, that's your prerogative, and I support your point of view. I certainly understand it, but I cannot. I need to read and discuss the Times, mostly because the issues cannot be made and the arguments can't be presented in a vacuum without a response. This show is a part of that response, by the way. This column, however, is very different. It's entitled, "To Stop Iran's Bomb, Bomb Iran." The column is penned by John R. Bolton. Bolton was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations from 2005 to 2008 under the Bush administration. He's a feisty and extremely capable diplomat with that famous mustache. I hear so many people say, if a Republican wins the White House, Bolton needs to be the next Secretary of State. In brief, Bolton says the following: you cannot trust Iran, and force is the only way to get a deal with them. Quote, "The inescapable conclusion is that Iran will not negotiate away its nuclear program, nor will sanctions block it building a broad and deep weapons infrastructure. The inconvenient truth is that only military action, like Israel's 1981 attack on Saddam Hussein's Osirik reactor in Iraq, or its 2007 destruction of a Syrian reactor designed and built by North Korea, can accomplish what is required. Time is terribly short, but a strike can still succeed." Bolton ends with a damning critique of the White House and Obama's Iran plan. Quote, "Mr. Obama's fascination with an Iranian nuclear deal always had an air of unreality. But by ignoring the strategic implications of such diplomacy, these talks have triggered a potential wave of nuclear programs. The president's biggest legacy could be a thoroughly nuclear weaponized Middle East," unquote. Bolton writes this piece in the New York Times, knowing full well that people reading it support the president. But he raises a series of questions that reasonable people need to ask. Granted, his conclusion is an exaggeration, but his point was actually well received by the reader. The argument had to have had support with the editors, otherwise they would not have run the column in the first place. In other words, even among fierce Obama supporters, there are serious doubts about the trustworthiness of the Iranians. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. There are 4 cartoons I want to discuss today. 3 cartoons are from the Arabic press, and the last is a propaganda cartoon created by the United States Army actually, and dropped into Syria. The first 3 are all the same genre. They depict Iran destroying or trampling the Arabs, and the Arabs doing nothing about it. The first cartoon has Iran's Grand Ayatollah stepping on the leadership of Yemen. The Ayatollah is wearing U.S. underwear. The idea in this whole cartoon is that while negotiating with the United States, Iran is gobbling up and destroying Arab countries as he stands there literally on top of Yemen itself. The next cartoon is also from the Arabic press. It depicts the Ayatollah shooting an Arab leader. The leader has a gun in his mind, not a real gun, an imaginary gun. It's coming out of the air, it's in his head. And all he can do is shout and bleed. The cartoon lampoons Arab leaders who cannot, do not, and will not stop the Iranians, a damning critique of their leadership. The next cartoon is also in the same genre. The Ayatollah again, only this time the Ayatollah is an octopus. And he's controlling Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Those are the names of the tentacles of the octopus. The last cartoon is a propaganda cartoon. It was created by the United States and dropped into Syria by plane. Massive papers thrown all over the place. The cartoon is a bit gory. The cartoon is actually trying to tell young Syrians not to join ISIS, that ISIS will destroy you, the cartoon says. So when you look at the cartoon, you'll see the cartoon depicts a group of boys in line, hesitant, especially the one first in line. But they're being shoved into a meat grinder. Blood is everywhere. The feet of one boy is actually sticking out of the meat grinder, has just been sent into the grinder itself. They're up in the air. The message is very clear. ISIS will destroy you. There is a long history of wartime propaganda. This actually is part of a psychological weapon of war. I don't know how effective it was, but it certainly made its point. Also, this is the first time the United States has actually become so graphic in this conflict in terms of sending out these kinds of messages. In a moment, my own perspective and a few predictions. While horrific things are happening on the macro level, real issues of concern and tragedy occur on the micro level, down on the ground. Yemen is imploding. Shiite Houthi has run the Yemeni government and leadership out of their own country. Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, the major city, and most other cities are in Houthi hands. The Houthi are Shiite Islamic extremists. And what about the Jewish community? Yes, a Jewish community still lives in Yemen. The community today only numbers about 100 Jews. In 1959, there were 60,000 Jews living in Yemen. Today, about 76 of the Jews live in Yemen. That live in Yemen live in the capital city of Sana'a. The others are scattered in other cities around the country. Over the years, a relationship actually developed between the Jewish community and the Arab community of Yemen itself. But recently, especially since September, when some very ugly acts were perpetrated by Islamists, the Jewish community began to live in fear. They are in fear not only because of the Houthi, but because of their once friendly neighbors. The Jews of Yemen are worried about their safety and security. Yemen once had a strong and proud Jewish community, rich in tradition and heritage. Those Jews who chose to remain did so because they felt comfortable and at home there. They stayed despite having opportunities, and plenty of them, to leave and go to Israel. Now their safety is in the balance. Also, I've been thinking about and predicting that Arab nations and their leaders were organizing to confront, at least attempting to confront, the Islamic extremism that's emerging. So, at the Arab League Summit, which wrapped up recently in Sharm el-Sheikh, as I predicted 3 weeks before that, the end would result in a decision to move ahead on a multinational force to confront ISIS from within the Arabic world. They're confronting ISIS and other Islamic extremist forces that are overtaking the region itself, like the Houthi in Yemen and extremists in Libya. Saudi Arabia has already successfully put together a 10-nation group that is acting against the Houthi in Yemen. Al-Sisi of Egypt concluded the summit by saying that it is essential to unite because the threats to the region are too great for any nation to fight alone. His assumption is that it will still take several months to work out the details of sharing power. In the past, these attempts by the Arab League to work harmoniously and united have failed. But today, the strength of ISIS, coupled with the crumbling disintegration of Libya, Yemen, and Iraq, countries where Islamic extremists stepped in with only a few hundred fighters and took over entire countries, is reason to worry that the entire nation and region is at risk. The summit viewed the entire move of the Houthi in Yemen, a move that was sponsored and supported by Iran, as an attempt to create a proxy conflict between Iran, the Shiites, and Saudi Arabia, the Sunnis. The Iranians are supporting and arming the Houthi. Saudi Arabia and her allies are confronting the Houthi. The big question is where the United States is in all of this. The U.S. had the intel and the background, but they made the conscious decision not to confront and not to irritate, not to bother the Iranians. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. I've been talking a lot about the Houthi. I should explain a little about who they are and their history. Houthi is actually a tribe, or better, one tribe divided into two. They were a break-off from Shia Islam, and for centuries they were persecuted by the Sunnis and the Shiites. When one looks at their actual traditions, they're more similar to Sunnis than they are to Shiites, but they are definitely, historically, a break-off from Shia. Their actual name of their sect of Islam is called Zayda Islam. They're also known as Ansar Allah, supporters of God in Arabic. Houthi is a tribe. It is a family name. They're a group trying to recreate their ancient region that included Yemen, parts of Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. Their current flag actually reads, "God is great, death to America, death to Israel, curse on the Jews, Victory to Islam. That's their flag. They're a group/tribe composing about a third of the population of Yemen. They are very well equipped, very motivated, but not very well organized or trained. But they are intimidating, and that makes a difference. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jim, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.